All right, hey guys, ready?
Jenna, handle this.
3 for 3.
All right. Look. Okay, that's $2.
Okay, you're live on Facebook.
All right, thanks, guys. All right, have a nice day. Very good. It's an essential item.
Should be clear now.
No, it's not. Soda.
All right, guys, we're live.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Lewis with Symbiotic Comics here. Joining me today is Dom.
Hello.
Luca, Gemma,
I'll hand you.
Hi.
and Jess. And we are also joined by a personal appearance from Landry Walker.
Woo!
Landry, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Well, as you know, my name is Landry Walker. I write comic books. I've been writing comic books for about 30 years. I've written for DC Comics, Disney, sort of Marvel, sort of sideways into Marvel through Disney. IDW, Boom, Lucasfilm. I've done a bunch of work on Star Wars, short stories and comics. I co-created, it's not fair to say I created, I shared it, a television show called Scary Larry that was based on one of my comics called Little Gloomy. I have done a couple different series for Image Comics. I've pretty much worked in almost every corner of the comics industry in terms of the creative end. I haven't really worked in distribution, so there's that. I used to work at a comic book store.
Cool.
Which is
Cool.
a great way to segue into comics, I think. So yeah.
I have a copy of The Last Siege sitting here next to me. I'm about halfway through it right now. And that's pretty recent, but if you can say what you're working on right now, or at least what you've worked on very recently, how about you share that?
Yeah, I've got a new book coming out with my frequent collaborator, Eric Jones, and also Rusty Drake and Pinot Vaughn. We have a book coming out called Supernova. Oh, it's called The Infinite Adventures of Pepper Page, Book 1, Supernova. I think that's a title. We went through a few, somehow in the age of where it's really good to have short, quick titles in social media, we went with the biggest title we could manage because we're not very good at this. And yeah, so it's called Pepper Page. It's coming out from First Second. It's a 200-page original graphic novel, and that comes out in February 2021. It's top secret, and I can't really say much about it, but I have been doing some more tiptoeing around the Star Wars universe. I'm not done playing with that, I think. It's a weird industry because you spend a lot of time working on stuff behind the scenes. You spend a lot of time creating things that no one ever sees. I've written a synopses or pitched probably 40 different Star Wars stories that no one's ever seen, 20 different Batman stories, and you never know like what's going to come together, especially with everything being kind of topsy-turvy in the world right now in general and how that's trickled into publishing. So I'm always working on something that would be a really big deal if it gets through all the hurdles. So I'm kind of working on 8 different things right now. Yeah.
Speaking of that, like, this is a weird second. Have you always been interested in writing, or if you haven't, like, where did you kind of pick it up from?
Well, it's kind of a combination of things. I was always interested in writing, though I hadn't really thought of it in that way. Like, I kind of first dipped my toes into that when, let's see, the first Indiana Jones movie was new, and I was about 10 years old, and so I tried writing, I guess what we'd now call fan fiction. It was probably called fan fiction then too, but I had no social circle and no internet to know that. And I was really into that. And Tolkien, I remember trying to write a short story that would be the story of what occurred in the minds of Moria, based on the notes of Tolkien, since that hadn't been explored in a story that I had seen, at least at that point. And so I was interested in an idea of storytelling. I basically, if there was something I liked, I wanted more of it. And the easiest way to do that was just to make it, which remains true. But then I didn't really think much of it. And I was in high school, and most of my friends were getting into doing, I had a lot of friends who were artists, very good artists, and I am not a good artist. And I noticed eventually that they just kept doing ideas for comics, and no one was producing a comic. And I realized what they didn't have was script. So I said, well, why don't I write stories? And so I teamed up primarily with my friend Eric Jones when we were about 17. No, I guess by this point we're about 19 years old, and we had been hanging out for a few years. And I started writing scripts for him. And him and I are still working together. It's been about almost 30 years we've been making comics together. He drew Supergirl Cosmic Adventures in the 8th grade. He drew almost all the Batman stuff I worked on. He drew most of the Star Wars stuff I've worked on. He's drawing, or just finishing drawing, the Supernova book that I mentioned. So yeah, it's basically a great way to keep hanging out with your friends, because without everyone having to go to jobs.
So yeah, you said like you met your friend Eric in school. Like, where did you like go to school, or did you go to school or college or anything?
No, I didn't really have the opportunity. We didn't have a lot of resources growing up. We were very poor, and so my formal education didn't really go past 9th grade. So I primarily taught myself. I definitely encourage everyone to pursue an education. All the people I know who were able to take advantage of that have had an easier road of it. But it is important to know, I think, for people that you can make it in any industry you want. I mean, I guess you probably couldn't become a doctor without going to school. So not every industry. Industries that don't involve putting your hands into
requiring of licensing,
surgical things. Now, okay, you get the idea. Anyone can be a writer. And I think that's an important thing. And I knew that at the time. I knew that was a path that was available to me. I didn't believe I needed a formal education for it. What I felt I needed to do was read. I needed to read everything I could. I read everything I could get my hands on, and studied it and tried to understand what the structure of storytelling was. So it can be very disheartening, I think, for people who lack resources to pursue education, but that should never be a barrier. You can always find a way.
All right. Well, we'll open the floor up to you a bit now. You can kind of.
Hello. So I can't tell if there's anyone. I assume it looks to me like it's just us. Are there more people? I have no idea how many people.
There are more people.
No.
We're also streaming through Facebook. So.
Oh my God, that's terrifying. Hello,
yeah.
Facebook people. I am sort of on Facebook these days.
The pressure will mount.
Yeah, right? Well, so I brought, this is my house. So this is not, it's just not my room. This is my wife's office. But I brought into here a really large stack, larger than I thought it would be, of things that I've written over the years. I don't have all the fancy technology of sharing screens, which, I mean, I do technically, I just don't know how to use it. So I'm just going to hold things up for the people. Some of you already know this, some of you don't. So I'm going to hold up some things and talk about some of the things I've written over the years. Does that work?
Yeah, that works.
Well, I did a couple of Incredibles books. So for Boom, this is back in 2010, I think. That was an unfortunate series because it got canceled. We were doing a 20-issue arc, and I got right up until the very, I wrote the whole thing, and the 16th issue, I think it was drawn, but the 15th issue was the last one that came out. And that book series, where I broke the family down to where it was just like Helen and Bob are on the verge of divorce. The kids are sneaking out at night. It's just, everything's gone bad. And there's all these manipulations of this supervillain and everything. And at this point, the city hates the Incredibles. They're throwing trash at them in the streets. Everything's as bad as it can be. And that was supposed to be, we've broken the team down to its lowest point so we can build it back up in the finale. Well, they can't get the finale. So my Incredibles series ends with people throwing trash at them.
Oh, that's...
Tears.
That was unfortunate. On the note of The Incredibles, when The Incredibles 2 came out, I got to dip my toe back into it, and I wrote this Dash's super secret notebook, which was a lot of fun. My brother-in-law, John Adams, did the artwork. I don't know if you can see any of it. It was meant to be drawn by Dash, and I'm really pleased with his stellar renditions of.
Great.
That was fun.
You guys have your friend draw like a fourth grader.
Exactly. That's. Let's see. I wrote a book series called Project Terra, where I did 2 novels, all ages science fiction novels. My favorite thing in this was a character named Claire, who is an alien sponge who doesn't move, talk, or emote in any way, shape, or form. But she's also the wisest of the bunch. I meant. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
That really says something about your characters when the wisest member is a unfeeling, unthinking sponge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a fun series. I did 2 books in that. I did the series called Little Gloomy, and this was actually the second series in Little Gloomy, the Super Scary Monster Show. We did a bunch of these. Eric and I worked for Disney Adventures magazine from about 2000 or 2001 until 2007 when the magazine shut down. So for about 7 years, I had comics, original creator owned, and this is an important thing, original creator owned comic series appearing in every issue of Disney Adventures, which was on sale in grocery stores across the world. They had an estimated readership of 5 million, but it wasn't within the comics industry as people think it. It wasn't for DC or Marvel, what people always say, the big 2. And meanwhile, books for the big 2 are selling 80,000, 100,000, and we're selling 5 million. But I go to conventions and people be like, wow, you really dropped off the map. What have you been up to? You still making comics? I'm like, yeah, they're for sale in every store you walk into. I just noticed something. They're for so they but we had this blind spot back then as an industry. We had this blind spot on what counted and didn't count. For an example, I was on a panel in 2003, I think, about comics in general with a bunch of Disney people and other people. And the question that came up was somebody in the audience asked, how do we get girls to read comics? And my answer was, because at that point I had been going to different schools and and meeting with groups of librarians. And I'd been doing this for a number of years of talking about comics in the classroom, how they can be used as an educational tool. And often we'd meet the kids who are reading comics. And over the time, we noticed all these schools had comics clubs and stuff. And it was almost always exclusively female. Like the readers that we would meet were almost always exclusively female. And I answered, I said, well, I don't think the question so much anymore that had so traditionally been, how do we get girls to read comics? Say, well, girls are reading comics. How do we retain like the boy audience? We're losing them to video games. And people said, girls aren't reading comics, they're reading manga. And the implication they had was that didn't count somehow, as if manga isn't just comics, because it's totally just comics. This whole idea that it only counts if they're reading the stuff I want them to read is a little absurd and creepy.
A little weird.
Yeah, a little bit. Like so at that time, and things have changed a lot when you see like the success of what's happening with the Scholastic books and whatnot, where people are, and DC is obviously making shifts towards catering further and further towards that market, which makes sense. Those books are selling infinitely more than what we sell as a single issue in a comic store. And I love the single issue comic format. But this archaic idea that DC and Marvel are the big 2 is really outdated, and has been outdated for a very long time.
Oh yeah, some Shonen Jump series are huge.
Yeah. So let's see. Speaking of DC, biting the hand that feeds me, I worked on Red Lanterns for a little bit. I came in and Charles Soule had been working on the series, but he left the series with 3 issues to go. So they brought me in just to kind of close it out which was difficult because there were a lot of weird loose ends to kind of tie together, but it was fun. I'm wearing my Red Lanterns power ring.
Cool.
I have the battery in my office that DC sent me, which is really nice of them. I do the comics adaptation of the Game of Thrones material, The Clash of Kings, the second book. I didn't do the first book. They asked me, but at the time I was working for the same publishers, that's Random House, Del Rey specifically. I was working on a book with Dean Koontz called of his Odd Thomas series. This was an original graphic novel in the manga style called House of Odd. So I was unavailable at the time, and George had somebody else he wanted to go with that's he'd worked with before, and they did really well. And that guy created a TV show now. He did a book series that's now some space TV show that's really popular. So I guess they picked well.
Before we move off of the Dean Koontz thing, how was it like to work with him? Because my mom's a fan of his work.
You know, it was interesting. I didn't interact with him much. Most of it all came through our editor, Betsy Mitchell, who is a wonderful editor. And I interacted with him a little. He supplied a paragraph of what he wanted. I read all the Odd Thomas books. I also read a lot of interviews with him because my job at that point is to write in his voice as much as possible, to shift my perspective into his and give truth to his characters that would remain constant from his books and not necessarily project my own, because whenever we write, we're often writing a bit of ourselves in every character. But in these instances, I was trying to write him into the characters. So it's a little different. But he had very few notes. He was really pleased with what we put together. I basically took his synopsis and expanded it into, I think it was a 160-page graphic novel, but I kept all his beats. He basically built the skeleton of a building, and I went and did all the drywall and the electrical and the plumbing. But the skeleton, the layout was his. So it was fun.
Cool. To shift gears a little to some of your other work, The Last Siege.
Last Siege.
I really like fantasy, and Lewis kind of likes medieval history a bit. I want to ask, like, did you do any like research for that type of thing, like for the architecture of the buildings, or like the swordplay, if anything? Or
yes and no. It's an interesting process because I worked on that. I remember I was hanging out with my friend Ivan and Eric, aforementioned Eric, always hanging out with him, at a Round Table Pizza, which I don't know that you have on the East Coast. And I had just picked up a Palm Pilot. It's weird the way memory all connects. And I had this idea for a 80 to 100 issue series called Siege. And this is in 2002. And they both told me I was crazy. They were right, because I didn't, as you can tell, I did not do 80 issues. But I'm a big fan of medieval history. I wanted to do a series that was not, sword and sorcery, which I also love that stuff too. But I'm particularly interested in castles, the defense, the way that castles are structured for defense, the evolution of things like the evolution and stage of how we shift from square towers to round towers, things like that, because
the Great Tower on the one side.
What's that?
With like how some in a lot of like later medieval towers, like the castles, they got the one bigger tower than the rest of them.
Yeah, everything is done based on like, well, last time that broke because they did this, so this time let's build it differently to try to prevent it from breaking again. And it's just the arms race functionally on this level that seems primitive to us but was super important at the time. So I have a giant library of books I acquired over about 15 years while I was putting together the story, just to immerse myself in life in the medieval era, the geography, the shifting politics. There's a lot, of course, in medieval history. Religion plays a huge part of it, but I didn't want to get as heavily into that. I think that's the religious story beats often overshadow everything
Yeah.
else. And as important as it is, it wasn't my story to tell. I wanted to tell a tale of
Different
war. When
story.
it really clicked was when I realized what I was writing was functionally a spaghetti western. It's stranger rides into town, takes over, drives the bad guys out, and prepares the town for the inevitable return of said bad guys. And so I wrote it all listening to music from spaghetti westerns. And I also, as much research as I did, like I said, with the religion, there comes a point where you go, I know that, I know how important it is, I know what a part it played, and I'm going to put that aside because that's not the story I want to tell. Just like there's a bit in the trade. I have a copy here. Let me see. There's a bit in the trade. Was actually the first thing I wrote when I sat down to write the scripts. I took a quote from, or at least I paraphrased a quote from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which was written over 1,000 years ago, and it was written from the perspective of the Saxons who had just been conquered by the Normans in 1066, and the quote was, "They filled the land with castles, and they filled the castles with devils," which I thought was fascinating because we normally hear of British history from the perspective of the Normans because the Normans conquered, set up rule, and what we have is a lineage that dates back through Norman history. The Saxons were taken out because Harold Saxon had the temerity to lead his troops in war, whereas in the Normans, the leader hung back and stayed safe. Anyway, the point is that they went in there and they built castles everywhere. But the interesting thing about castles is that if you portray medieval history accurately, and this gets to the heart of the question, did I do my research? If you portray medieval history accurately, a castle would be a really polished looking thing. It would be plastered. It would be painted like a yellow or a pink. It would, they were very bright colored, often done to help weather to help keep the rain at bay and whatnot, and protect it, because it was a huge investment of property and time and resources, and they wanted their stuff to look nice, just like we do now. But if you did that, everyone would look and go, wow, they don't know what castles look like. Why isn't it gray and crumbling? That's what castles look like. We have to, when we're doing historical fiction, the fiction is ultimately becomes in some ways more important, because if you service things accurately, you're going to look like you're doing it wrong because of preconceptions. And we can't stand in the comic store and tell them, no, castles are supposed to be yellow. It's supposed to look like that. It wouldn't have the grittiness people want, and that would derail things. So I'll go on at length. So that's my answer on that.
No, I think it's cool because it's like if you portray it exactly the way it really was, it could be boring. It could be seen as wrong. People wouldn't quite understand it.
And it would lose the energy.
Yeah, and it's the same way with how, like, the medieval combat is also different from the way it is in movies. Like,
oh yeah,
there's a lot more of a martial art to it rather than people believe.
Yeah,
I think it's just hit people with the sword, but there is, like, of course, a way to actually do it properly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
All right, we're gonna open up to Q&A with the guests on both Facebook and here now. So if you have any questions, feel free to post them and we'll catch them. Aside from that, if anybody here has a starting question they want to ask Landry, just to get things going.
I mean, mine kind of relates back to the question we just asked, but like, what got you interested in medieval like history? Like, why? Like, yeah, why is it? Because I love it.
Because one, it's awesome, and castles are awesome, and how can you not love a castle? I really love the concept that the Normans came in and instituted of the I forget what it's called right now, the system, the vassal system, the vassal structure, where the king owns all the land and bequeaths the management of it to, say, a baron, and that baron breaks it up and bequeaths sections of it to knights, and it all became about property rights and rent income and then when the king would call people to war, he'd just call up his barons and they would call up their knights and the knights would call up their peasants. And so suddenly they've got this big army. So it's basically
Feudalism.
just management system. I think it's kind of fascinating. I also got really hooked on this game back in 2002 called Stronghold by a company called Firefly, where it's you basically build castles and defend them. And I don't play a lot of video games, and I still play that game and every game in that series for almost 20 years now.
I think a new one's coming out.
Mm-hmm. Warlords. I played the demo. The first one they did set in Japan, because previously it was either in the Middle East or in like England, Europe. Yeah, I love those games. I still play them regularly.
Yeah. Okay.
I have a question. How did you get the inspiration for anything you write?
Oh, for anything I write? Well, honestly, okay, so a lot of it I get a lot of inspiration from music. Different music evokes different moods and tones. And of course, it helps if, say, somebody calls me up and says, we want you to work on Batman. And then I already have a history of, researching the character. But the specifics of a story, I often will put on music. I'll find a song that inspires me, that creates some kind of emotional resonance. It brings about scenes in my head, and I'll put that song often on loop for like 50 to 100 times. So it's just background noise while I'm working. It's creating a soundtrack for the work. And if that stops working, I find a new song. And sometimes I have a couple days where I'm not really doing anything but looking for music to inspire me.
So Landry, I have a question. On your Facebook page, there is a puppet that you have on there, and I was just wondering, number one, what's that all about, and is that a puppet of you?
It is a puppet of me. It needs a little bit of updating. I have it here. I'm going to share it. So the deal with the puppet was originally, okay, so Eric, my frequent collaborator, I mentioned, him and his wife have puppet versions of themselves. Eric and I were putting together our Supernova book, the Pepper Page book. And at that time we were thinking about kickstarting it. We hadn't pitched it yet. And we were going to, along with our friend Pinnell, we were going to pitch it, but I've had to make an exception in our modern technological world. I usually avoid the camera. I don't usually I generally don't like my face out there. And so I didn't want to do a Kickstarter video because, like I said, I don't like being the focus of things. So we were going to do our Kickstarter video with puppets. And so this was going to be me. Hello. So, yeah.
It's awesome.
Thank you.
So did you have to send away for it? Like, how did you have it made?
Now I cheated. I'd like to say that I stitched this together myself, but no. Several years ago, there was a toy store. I'm blanking on the name. A major toy store. There was a major toy store. What are they called? They worked with the Henson Studios and they released build a puppet sort of things. You could order it. So they had like 6 or 7 different blank body types. So I found the one I thought would work best for me. This green one, I believe it's green. I'm colorblind. These glasses are actually, they're tinted because they're the colorblind correction lenses. This is green.
I'm colorblind too.
What? Yeah?
I'm colorblind too.
The glasses are weird just so you know, I don't know how well they work. Sometimes I feel like they work really well, and suddenly I'm like, oh my God, that's purple. I've never seen purple before. And other times I go, are they just tinted? Are they tricking me?
Are you being made a fool?
Yeah, well, they're also the only glasses I have that aren't scratched, so I started wearing them a lot. But it's possible they work. I'm not sure. I only got, this is a segue, but the company that makes these is located in Berkeley. And at the time, Image Comics was located in Berkeley. So they reached out to Image, said, are any of your creators colorblind? And so they sent me down to try them out, and voila.
All right, I have one more question. So if you could give 1 or 2 tips to any writers, up and coming writers out there, what would those tips be?
I mean, the most important thing,
day and age and everything like that, with everything changing, I don't know, if you had 2 things that you could share with us.
the most important thing to do is to write, and the next most important thing to do is to read. Like, every bit of time you have that you can manage it, it's important to put pencil to paper, so to speak. It's also the third most important thing, though, is to go out and live your life, to go and experience things. That's one of the reasons reading is so important, because you're experiencing other people's viewpoints. It's especially important to invest yourselves in things you don't like. Like, I was giving advice to this artist, this young artist I know. She's like 12 and she's 10 years ahead of where she would normally be. Brilliant artist, but she's drawing the same thing over and over again, which is a thing that artists will fall into when they're young. And you say, draw the things you don't want to draw. Draw the things that are hard for you to draw. Challenge yourself. Well, for a writer, the version of that is get out, go experience life. Because if you and then read things that you normally maybe you wouldn't. Like, I at one point I picked up a Jackie Collins novel, which wasn't really my speed, but I learned a lot from reading it, because it was so out of my lane. If all you do, let's say you want to write Batman, and all you do is read Batman, what are you bringing to the table that other people didn't already do? So you've got to get out there and experience life. You have to read other people's stories. You have to, even things like, there's a storyboard artist gave a bit of advice that you can learn more from watching one bad movie and figuring out why it didn't work than you can from watching 100 good movies. And I think that's very true. Don't dismiss anything just because it looks bad. If you want to work creatively, dive into that and figure out why it didn't work. And then reverse engineer it and figure out what you would have done differently. How would you fix it? Because at some point you will be faced with that same problem. And unless you practice, just like anything, unless you practiced your solutions, you are going to go through hell trying to figure out how to fix something. So
That's really good. That is really good. Thank you.
no problem.
So I have one last quick question. It's not often that we get a writer on the show, so I wanted to ask while you were here. A lot of people miss in the process with writers that you're not just writing the story, you're also communicating with all the artists to make sure they have the right thing that they're drawing. Could you tell us a bit about that process and the stuff that people don't necessarily immediately think of when they think of a writer?
Well, most of the people who are likely to be listening to this will have some sense of how it works, I imagine, more than your average person. Now, there's a lot of people I meet who, after they find out what I do, will go, so you write the little letters in the balloons. Now, that's the most simple understanding, because of course I don't do that at all. I'd be terrible at that. That's a letterer's job. I do script the dialogue. There's so many different ways you can create a comic from a writing and drawing perspective. Now, I've worked with a lot of different artists, and one of those is Eric, who I've worked with on a whole bunch of different books. And how I write for him is not necessarily how I'm going to write for, say, someone else. Like, my Game of Thrones scripts are dense, because with that, I'm literally taking somebody else's work and I'm breaking it down and creating a structure for it. So I have to give a lot of direction to the artist. Mel Ruby, who does beautiful work, and we put him through so much. A panel description on that might be half a page of text. It's a lot to go through. And whereas if it's something that's more fluid, I might just say, we need a 5-panel fight scene here, and it's got to end with this guy on the ground. And sometimes you do that and you let the artist just play with it. The Pepper Page Supernova book I did most recently, we wrote in kind of this mishmash of the Marvel style and traditional style, which the Marvel style of writing is often plot-based, where you give the artist a page-by-page breakdown of what's going to happen. They create it, which I feel is basically them doing a lot of the writing, and then you come in and script it. With this one, I wrote a huge amount of dialogue, but I didn't do panel and page breakdown. So I've got a script here for an example. Actually, give me a second. That's the Catman issue. Let's see. This is a script somewhere in here for my Batman Brave and the Bold comic series. I'm so ready, you can tell. Like there would be something to say, you know, organizing things ahead of time, but why would I do that? Like then I'd have to talk more. Okay, this is not the issue I was hoping to find, but it is an issue. This is what, say, now when I hold this up, is it angled the right way? Like it's not reversed, mirror imaged or anything?
Nope.
No, it's good.
Okay, good. So this is how I normally break down a script. There's probably typos and horribly embarrassed. This is not something you normally share with people, right?
Yeah.
But I do a, you know, page and panel breakdown. I do what's called full script, where I put in like the details of the page, how many panels I want, where I want the panels, sometimes the camera angles. That's usually how I work. Now, the important thing when you're working with an artist is realizing they are on the front line of the execution. I can say all of that. I can say I want a 9-panel page here, but sometimes it's important for the artist to look at this and go, this isn't what's going to work here. Now, unless I put in a note going, this is an important thing, like we're doing this, I did this for a reason. You've got to let the artist breathe. They have to, one, be enjoying what they're doing, or else it's going to just be a nightmare for them. They have to find a way to execute it. And like, I try to imagine somebody telling me how to write something, which has happened, and it's so much harder. It's like, so I'll write full script, but often it's meant as a suggestion. These are suggestions. If you don't know what to do here, I've given you some guidance. If you just want that, and some do, then here's what you do. But it's important to give artists the flexibility to create. They're on the front lines. They have to execute it. They honestly deserve the lion's share of the credit for comics. We don't give it to them in this day and age, which is weird. Is so weird. They do infinitely more physical labor on the book. And yet all too often you'll hear, you know, like Danger Club by Landry Walker. Well, it's Danger Club by Landry Walker, Eric Jones, Michael Drake, and so on. You know, as an example.
Thank you for sharing with us.
Okay.
So we're gonna announce the giveaway winner now. Drum roll, please. Benjamin Majeski. Congratulations, you have won a signed copy of Volume 1 of Danger Club.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
You can find all of our socials and all of Landry's socials in the group chat currently to the Zoom meeting, and they should also be on the screen momentarily. Be sure to check us out for making sure you know when our next PA is going to be, and so that you can get our merch and Landry's merch, which we'll have in the store now, some of which will be signed. And be sure to check out Landry, because I'm sure he has tons of cool stuff that you can ask him on Twitter that we didn't cover today. All right, well, thank you for joining us, Landry.
Thank
Unless
you.
anybody has any other last minute questions, I think that's all.
That's all from me.
Thanks, Landry.
Thank you. I really appreciate
Awesome.
that. That was fun.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Now I have to figure out how I disconnect this. Oh, there's a leave button.
Yeah.
Seems rude. Like I'm just going to leave. Like
Yep.
I think there's a door slam button.
You.
All right, thank you so much.
I wish I'd be using that button constantly.
All right. Take care. Bye.